please take it from here.
Thanks so much, Steph. I have been such a huge fan of what you guys are doing. And so thanks for everyone for tuning in super early in the morning. This is my 5th year with Startup Boston. So I feel like it's grown so much over the last 5 years. What I thought would make sense today is to spend maybe about 10 minutes talking about some of the do's and don'ts for pitch decks. Spend the bulk of it going through actual pitch deck examples. I've chosen from a select variety of pitch decks. It's not just a single one in a single industry. And then we'll wrap up with some just basic resources, some templates, some do-it-yourself tools, and see where we go with that. First thing I want to do is just kick off to get a sense of where everyone is in terms of how you're feeling about your own pitch deck. And so I do want to launch a poll. And Steph, just to give you a little bit of heads up, I actually can't see the chat and the poll questions. I'm not sure if it's like my window or something, and so I can't see anyone. So if you can just make sure that if there's anything that's big, just let me know. But I do want to ask folks, if you have a pitch deck, what shape is it in? And if you take a look at the poll, really straightforward. At the one end of the spectrum, you have a fantastic pitch deck that you've used before. You're a seasoned entrepreneur, you have lots of experience, and you feel great about it. And then on the other end of the extreme, you have no idea what you're doing. And so I'll give folks maybe like 10 seconds just to answer things. And I'm going to just switch over and see what.
I was actually going to tell you what the results were since you mentioned it. So it looks like right now we're tied with good, okay, and bad at the moment, but still waiting. Let's give people a few more seconds to trickle in, and then I can definitely keep you posted on that.
Sounds great. And Steph, just a quick thing on this side. I can see the polls, but when I navigate over to the chat and Q&A, they're empty for me. I don't know whether or not that's just me.
Oh, so for your chat, David, you just have to click session chat next to speakers. Right now you're on the speaker chat. But if you click session, that's the one where everyone can see it.
Got it. Okay. Thank you very much. User error.
Of course. No, you're good. It's always good to get product feedback as well. We love that.
Fantastic.
All right, David. So just so you know, I think we can close the poll, but the most voted by 38% is okay. And then good is at 30%. Bad is at 23%. And we only have 7% agreed.
Okay. Well, good. I do want to keep this session as interactive as possible over the course of the hour. And whether you have other experiences that are relevant for folks, or if you disagree with something I'm saying, I would love to see it in the chat. And probably more importantly, other people are going to benefit from that. And so please chime in as you have different experiences, especially for those of you that have great pitch decks, because I can learn something from you as well. So let's just launch right in. We've got 7 do's and 7 don'ts. A couple of do's. So on the do side, make sure you target and refine your audience. I can't tell you the number of times that I've seen like a sales deck for a customer used as an investor pitch deck, or someone taking some materials that they put together in the past and like slapping it together and sending it to an investor. And so you just can't do that. You want to make sure you understand who your audience is. And even deeper than that, you got to make sure when you have an audience that you have decent context around that person. And so the worst thing you can do is show up and know nothing about your target. And so investors, especially true. So you got to do a little bit of research. So that's the first to do. The second one that I hear a lot about is what really resonates with people. And people have difficulty striking the balance between how much story to tell and how much data to provide. And so what I hear from some folks is like, how aggressive should I be? And the trick is most pitches have both of those elements. And then depending on your audience, the story may resonate with them more, or the data may resonate with them more. And especially at the early stages, sometimes you don't have a lot of data. And so you got to rely heavily on the story. That balance is something that's really key to make sure that you have. And so when you refine your pitch deck, figure out what really works. And then as you get feedback, you want to adjust that. The third one is you want to make sure to adapt the content to the venue itself, especially today when we're doing so much stuff remotely. A pitch on Zoom from home is really different from sitting down with someone at a coffee shop, really different from sitting down in an office with a handful of other people when you're doing a 2-hour presentation. So adapt the content, adapt to the venue, and adapt the amount of time that you have. And so you want to make sure to selectively pick from that. And then the final to do before I go through a couple of the common mistakes and don'ts is you want to make sure that you anchor the audience on what we call the summit and the base camp. And so a common question that I get from folks is like, how aggressive should I be? How optimistic should my pitch deck be? And depending on your own personality, you may find that you are very naturally a very optimistic person and you can talk about the really big vision. Or you might be someone that's like super realistic and conservative, in which case it makes you uncomfortable to talk about something that's really big. But the challenge is for an investor, you got to make sure that you anchor that person on both of those things. And so what is the big vision and what's your next credible step? And when they walk away, those two things should be really clear in their heads. And so somehow, whether you have 5 minutes, 10 minutes, an hour with them, 2 hours with them, you want to make sure they walk away with like the big stuff and also what's credible. Okay, let's switch over to some of the common mistakes and some of the don'ts. So don't be tempted to share everything at once. Seen a handful of cases where entrepreneurs get so excited when they get in front of someone that they just like, oh, let me send you everything. Let me send you a description. You want a pitch deck? I got all these materials. I've got screenshots. I got a demo to send you. A handful of times I've even gotten people send me like the investment docs before I've even met them, like in a cold email. It's like, that doesn't work. You want to choose very specifically. In the dating analogy, you don't show up and propose to someone on the first day, right? So you want to make sure to use these materials appropriately. The purposes of this morning's talk is really around that pitch deck, right? And so you probably have some other materials like basic descriptions of what you're working on, a snippet of a paragraph that you may use, maybe like a one-pager, but we're going to focus specifically on the dozen or so slides that you use as part of pitch deck. Another big mistake that people make is guaranteed you are going to get conflicting feedback from people that you speak to. I've never seen a case where that doesn't happen. And so the challenge for you is how do you incorporate that feedback without overreacting? I've seen a lot of founders essentially react to every single thing that and whatever the last thing that they've heard is essentially the thing that they bake back in their deck. And so they swing back and forth, and you want to avoid those whiplash changes. What you're going to do is you're going to hear some consistent themes. So if you hear something once, okay, make a note of it. If you hear it second time, third time, then there's clearly something about either the content, the messaging, or maybe the actual strategy that doesn't resonate with people. And so when you see that, then make those changes. And this final one I have to throw in there because this is a little bit of a nitpick of mine, is that you can't be sloppy and you miss details. And the number of times that you see someone that has like typos, or the caps aren't consistent, or the font is a little off, or the color is like, they've randomly chosen colors and alignment, like those details really, really matter. And so before you send anything out, just make sure you give everything a once over. Okay, cool. So that was the first 10 minutes, and we're actually at 8:10, so we're going to stay on track. I do want to switch over to the deck itself. I'm going to park on a few things. I purposely, because this is pretty visual, posted a copy of this at on my website. And so if you go to davidchang.me/startup-tips, it's the first link that's there. And so feel free to take a look at it because we're going to go into detail, quite a bit of detail for each of these slides. And so why is a deck so important? Especially now where people are remote and doing a lot of stuff from their homes. It essentially speaks for you when you're not there, and it can open doors. And so you do want to spend a fair bit of time like making sure that you get things right. Here's, in no particular order, the typical key parts of a slide, key slides that are in a pitch deck for an early stage investor. So we're going to go through in each of these details. I often get the question of like, do the order of the slides matter? Yes and no. If you're going to send something beforehand, then people can flip back and forth. It does matter because as you're building a narrative, it's very hoppy, right? If you have to force someone to jump through stuff. And so then order does matter. And then especially if you're actually presenting this either in an office, or if you have to stand up and give a presentation, the order definitely matters, right? And so you want to pay attention to that. So we'll go through what a common order is, and I'll just go again, slide by slide. So the first one, this title slide, the intro, it's often wasted. I've seen a lot of cases where the founder sort of just parks on the slide and it's just got the company name. Sure, there's no tagline, there's nothing to orient themselves. You got to keep in mind when you talk to a new investor or someone that doesn't know what you're doing, there's a lot of different things that you could be doing. And so I plucked this one particular example out from Canva because I like the way they positioned their venture. Right. And so even without looking at anything and just reading, I can get a sense of the space that they're in. And so your goal for this very title slide is you're likely going to have that park there for a while, is to use that time and use that space. You want to orient the audience, you want to set the stage. I've seen other good examples where someone describes that as the space that they're in. Sometimes you can use a tagline if the tagline is also informative and descriptive. I've seen some other cases where it's where X for Y, right? And so that also helps orient people a little bit. If you have some eye candy, like in this case, they're showing their website, they're showing the tools, that's great as well, right? And so just make sure you use that title slide and you don't clutter it with other stuff. And so that's one that's often wasted. The next slide that you really should put into your deck is defining the burning problem, right? You've been living your startup, you've been living your venture for a little while, you know what the problem is, but if I've never met you before, I have no idea what problem you're trying to solve. And so if you think of this as a movie, you want to set things up so that I care about what happens later. And so the example that I plucked out of here was a fairly straightforward one. I think this deck was from the Uber pitch deck from probably 10 years ago. Not particularly well designed, right? It's just a bunch of bullet points, and there's one that has like one sub bullet point with, I think it's actually, it's got a caps that's missing. And so there's definitely mistakes in there. But in terms of content, it's pretty effective, right? In terms of like setting up the pain point for like why someone should care about this. One common mistake that people have is that you spend too much time on the problem side. And so the challenge is if I start to lose interest in what you're talking about before you even get to the solution, then you've just wasted a whole bunch of time and effort, right? And so definitely don't do that. So just spend just enough time so you establish the problem, establish a big pain, and then you can move on. And so in a 20-minute pitch, no more than like 90 seconds on the problem. So then you go to the next slide. It sets it up for you have a particular solution. So I took this example from Airbnb. Here's where you explain your concept. You talk about the value proposition. You talk about like generally the business benefits. It's imagine a world where that problem no longer exists. And that's what your solution is, right? And so a common mistake here is that someone typically, if you have a very technical product, you go way too deep in terms of because you're so excited about like what you've developed and all this great stuff. And so you've sort of lost me. Like, I don't really care how it's done. I need to understand like, how does it solve that problem? Why should I care? How does the target audience benefit from the fact that you've got this thing out there? And so make sure you show that to me before you actually move on to the next slide. Okay. And there's one particular example. There were 3 key points that Airbnb wanted to convey. And so they used icons. They put a picture of one of their houses just in the background. So you get a little bit of a feel for what space that they're in. And it's really straightforward. And so you can spend a good amount of time just talking about like, what the concept is. The next slide, and people often struggle with this one, is defining the actual opportunity. And I've seen so many examples of good ones, bad ones. Sometimes if you don't have a lot of data on your market, you'll just sort of throw out some data points on, oh, here's how many consumers that are part of this market, or some stat about like the number of times that something is done. And so it's very difficult to wrap your arms around that. And so the most generally accepted structure at the early stages these days is defining TAM, SAM, SOM. So the total addressable market, what you can service, and what you can obtain. And so those 3 things now investors are trained to understand. And so for this particular example, for those of you that really follow Boston Tech, so we had 4 IPOs of Boston Tech companies this week. So I decided to pluck one of them. In the S1 filing for Toast, this slide actually appears. And so big company, obviously, lots of good stuff that's happening there. They were able to distill down their market opportunity into these 3 buckets. And so if you look at how they did that, they defined a total addressable audience, right? A total addressable market of 110 plus billion, right? And they refine that by cutting it down. And so the labels that they put on this are a little bit different from what I normally see in early stage, but the concept still applies. In this case, they trimmed down their total market and slimmed it down by geography. And they said, okay, in the US, it's a certain size, right? It's a subset of that. For you, what you want to do is for your TAM, you want to have something that is pretty big, right? And I'd say at least $1 billion. It'd be very difficult. And again, this is for venture-backed companies. And if you're doing something that is not venture-backed, these rules don't apply, right? Because there's a whole set of other great businesses that aren't venture-backed, but for the purposes of a venture-backed pitch, that TAM needs to be in the billions. And so it has to be a pretty big number. And so make sure that you are expansive enough to figure out like how big of a market can you actually envision, right? So you want to go really big on that front. The second thing in terms of what's serviceable, the way to think about that is that it's the subset of the TAM. So this is the middle segment. It's the subset of the TAM that your solution could service. And it's typically within a geography. And so if you are just operating in a particular country and your products are really applicable in that country, and because of either regulations or for reach or distribution or whatever, you want to haircut that TAM down to something. And so this one's fairly difficult for a lot of folks to carve out because they don't know what the boundaries are around their solution. And it's difficult sometimes to know exactly, well, if I add a couple features, I could put this in another geography. And so this is one where you want to spend a little extra time, work with other people that have done this to define a SAM, a serviceable available market, to something that's pretty refined. And then the very last one, the smallest one, is this serviceable obtainable market. And these words do not roll off the tongue. And so which is why people say TAM, SAM, SOM. On the SOM case, the smallest one, it's the subset of the SAM that you can capture. So think of this as if there was no competition at all in the space and you were the only player and you had 100% market share, then your SOM would equal your SAM, right? But competition exists. It's effectively the portion that you can capture. And so that number hopefully is in the 100 million range, right? And so if you can't see a path to 100 million, if everything goes right, then you want to refine like how you present your product, what the edges are around the product. But this is just one example. Saw it fresh from the S1, figured I'd include it as part of this. Cool. Now, the next slide is the product itself. You want to show what this thing is. And this is not a fantastic example, but it is one example from Snap, which showed about midway through the deck, like what the experience actually was for you to use the product in the early days. And obviously it's evolved since then. But if you have a B2C product, it's great because you actually show it. You get to talk about it. And if you're a product-oriented founder, that's awesome. Like this is the space where you live, right? Talking about your own stuff. If it's a digital service, something that's a website or a mobile app, really easy to put screenshots. If you are working on something that's more enterprise or B2B, sometimes you show things like a feature, function, benefit sort of thing. Don't throw too much stuff on the slide. You want to make sure to be pretty balanced when it comes to not overwhelming the audience, but that feature, function, benefit works particularly well for stuff that you have to explain. Another place that you can park on is if you have a demo, this would be an ideal time. And especially if you're meeting someone live, you can do this back and forth where it's like, hey, does the message resonate so far? I've told you about my solution like 2 slides ago. Do you want to see how it works? I can talk about it. I can show you a demo. The how it works is often very eye-opening for people, and especially for investors that like want to understand the inner workings. So you want to use this part of the slide or this part of the deck to go through that. And so you may go off script for a little while, do your demo, and then you come back. Cool. Going to the next one, a really key piece is your actual go-to-market. This particular one was from mint.com. And I thought what was really instructive about this one is that they walk through like a couple different acquisition channels. And so for this particular business, they thought about the partners, they thought about the strategy, they were able to articulate it. This go-to-market is often missing like altogether from early stage pitches. And the thing I hear frequently from founders that are first time or that haven't done this particular slide before is that they don't even know how to describe it. And that's definitely a challenge because then as an investor, all I'm looking at is that you've built this cool thing, you've defined a problem, you've got the solution, but I have no idea whether or not people will use it. I have no idea how you'll get in front of your target customers. So you really got to be able to describe that. In some businesses, the key differentiator is actually how they go to market, either because they have some unique partnership, they have a killer channel, They have some embedded way of getting in front of someone. So whatever those things are, even if it's not super differentiated, it's something that you've got to talk about, because in the long term, if you build a product and no one uses it, then you don't have a business. So this slide, this go-to-market, takes a lot of different versions. There's customer acquisition, there's distribution partners, there's channels, all those things. Ultimately, you got to be able to communicate like how you're going to get this thing in front of people. And so that's why this particular one is so critical for early stage companies. The next one is, I've seen a couple different words that are put on top of this one. I've seen business model, I've seen revenue model, I've seen pricing, lots of different examples of how someone would describe it. But ultimately, even if you're not charging and you're not making money yet, you've got to be able to communicate how it will eventually make money, right? And so if you're working on something that's more of an audience-based business where maybe it's free in the beginning or it's a freemium kind of model, you still need to describe like ultimately what that is, and it'll change over time. And so I plucked this example out for monthly because I thought they did a really nice job of just like articulating what the key components are. And so if it's tiered pricing, great, put that up there. If it's something that's a little bit harder to communicate because it's not a direct to consumer, at least you want to give some sense of like willingness to pay. If you're in the early stages and you only have a couple customers or maybe none, you've got to give a little bit of a feeling for like what that general price level is, right? And ultimately what will sustain the business, right? And so this is also a key one that I often see missing from pitch decks. The next one is around competition, and I also see a few different labels next to this one. It's competitive landscape, competition, alternatives. There's a few different ways that people have used to use this slide to describe where they sit in the space. One really common one, and this is plucked from LinkedIn's early deck, is the axes, right? The 2x2 boxes where you try to put yourself on the top left. And the takeaway from this one is that you want to choose those two axes very carefully, because those axes tell how you view the world. And it's a bet of like positioning as well, right? And so on the x-axis, you have one dimension that you're going to exceed on, and then the y-axis is another. And in this particular case, LinkedIn is painting themselves in a box where there's a bunch of others. And so even there, they've got to tell how they're differentiated. And so we're in the top right. This also tells the audience quite a bit of like where you draw the boundary. And so if you zoom out a little bit, like beyond this 2x2, there are all these other competitors, potential partners, other people in the value chain that might actually be competition in the future, but you don't define them as competition today, which is fine, which is great. Maybe they're partners in the beginning with, but choosing those axes are really important because it defines the boundary that you play in, right? And in the early stages, you're trying to win at that box that you're playing in and then ultimately expand beyond it. Okay, so that's one way that we see a lot of competition slides. Another one, if you can't figure out a really good way to present that, is your typical feature grid. So I see that a lot where you essentially put a bunch of key competitors on one axis, you list features on the other side. It's okay. Like, I'm not a huge fan of it. In some cases, it works really well. I think this kind of slide is actually much more appropriate for like a sales pitch. So if you're talking to a prospective customer and they know of other solutions, they want to understand, well, each of these features. But if I'm an investor and this is the first time that I'm seeing your stuff, I don't really know if I really have to see all those features, right? And so it's not helpful for me. It might be helpful for others. So this might be one that you tuck deep into the appendix. The next one is traction. So one key thing is you got to be able to communicate like where on the journey you are. Are you in the very earliest days where you just got the idea, just pulling together the pitch deck? Maybe you had a couple conversations and there's no traction, right? And that's one thing. Are you in a place where you're post-launch and you have a product, but you're not generating revenues yet? Maybe you're generating some revenues, and the next big thing is big partnerships, whatever those things are. This eye candy slide, if you have any sort of metric to show, is extremely memorable from an investor standpoint. And so sometimes it's around optics, but if you can find any metric that's growing over time, you absolutely want to put this on your traction slide. And you can put some other stuff on there, right? You may have multiple KPIs that you're tracking. But ultimately, the takeaway from this is make sure you show something that is up and to the right, because it gives the person, your audience, a sense of velocity and momentum. And that's something that you absolutely want to communicate. And especially if you are in the early stages and you don't have some early traction, what I've seen done is that you can put some proof points. So they're not exactly milestones, but you can put some proof points as to why you think you're onto something. And so if you look in your past, anything that has been de-risked is essentially what you want to put on this slide. If you can't put together a chart, of some metric that's going up and to the right, right? This is a pretty easy one. And so I took this from Zoe Barry. So Zoe's got a terrific pitch deck template that you should also download and take a look at. Here's a couple key things. People think this is the easiest slide, so I just throw my name up there and roll. So there's a few best practices here. So one, make sure you include your key people who are on your team. Make sure you include their roles. I've often seen people just list like co-founder, and it's unclear to me like who's doing what. And it's less about the titles and more about like functionally what hat are they wearing, even if it changes over time. I want to understand at a 1,000-foot view that different functions are covered. And so you want to make sure to do that. Under each of the team members, you also want to just toss out whether or not they have specific backgrounds that are relevant to the venture that you're working on. So sometimes it's a past company that they've had experience in that. Sometimes it's maybe you were a customer in this industry, and so you list out maybe the big company that you were part of. If you were not at a big company, that's fine too. Like list out like one or two things that make you particularly qualified for this particular venture. And so you want to include that. I've seen people put some schools on there. That's fine too. The advisor piece, sometimes you break it out into two different slides. I often see the advisors kind of placed on the bottom. And there's a couple key types of advisors you want to add, because in the early days, you don't have a full team. And it's okay that one of your advisors actually wears one of those functional hats, but just make a note of it, right? And so you want to call that out. And over time, what you do is, as you build up your team, more and more of that stuff gets insourced, right? And part of your team, and you rely less and less on the advisors, and you actually change advisors over time. And then the second to last slide is the ask. And because this is a fundraising deck, there's three key parts of the ask. It's the how much you're asking for, right? It's really clear here as an example from Intercom. How much you're asking for, what you're going to use the money for. And so that's usually generally pretty easy for people to describe. I'm going to use it to hire engineers, or I'm going to use it to go to market, or I'm going to spend it on a marketing campaign, whatever those things are, just the key use of proceeds. And then the third one is the thing that I see often people missing, which is what are the milestones that'll be achieved? And so what I frequently see on the ask slides is just the ask and the use of proceeds, and there's no mention of like what happens. And great, you'll run out of money in 18 months. And then what happens after that? The way to think about this is that it's de-risking the venture, that if you were to fast forward where the venture will go in that period of time, there's something that's qualitatively different about the company at that point. Maybe you are proving that there's a specific acquisition channel that's going to be key, right? So maybe that's the key milestone. Maybe it's you're developing the product for the very first time and there's high technical risk, right? That it's not a no-brainer that this thing could be developed, and that's something that's de-risking. So you want to make sure to list the one or two key milestones that de-risk the venture. And then on the closing slide, much like the very beginning, first slide, which is why I include that same example, this is not a throwaway slide. In some cases, you put your contact info. In other cases, there might be a memorable takeaway. There could be a call to action, whatever those things are. Like you end up parking on that slide sometimes. And another mistake I typically see is that when the conversation breaks into Q&A, it's sort of just left on whatever slide you were talking through. And so you want to be conscious about that. And then if the conversation changes, you flip it to this last slide, which gives you the ability to then take it in any direction, which is the same reason why you actually want to have a pretty good appendix. In this narrative, there's plenty of other content that you actually put in there, but a really good rule of thumb is that if you hear the same couple questions all the time, make sure to tuck it in the appendix for lots of reasons. One, it'll ensure that you're pretty prepped, but two, it'll also demonstrate the fact that you know what you're doing and your experience. And so those are all things that you absolutely want to do over time. Great. So just to stay on track, because I want to make sure to keep this as interactive as possible, I'm going to start looking back to the chat. I do want to launch another poll, and this is just the last one. We just walked through a dozen different slides and very cursory, kind of top of line, couple comments around there. And so which of these do you feel still needs a little bit more of a deep dive from your standpoint? And so depending on what the results are, we may go deeper in one. I may pull some people up on stage so they can talk, they can ask a little bit more in detail. Might look through some of the chat. I'm going to put some of the other folks on the spotlight for a little bit, but it'd be great if we launch that poll now and then spend essentially the next 15 to 20 minutes through that, and then I've got a couple like final tips and resources for you to wrap out the morning.
So right now, business model is winning, but you can still see some back and forth. I feel like I'm like a sports announcer right now.
There you go. You got to put on
like,
your,
let's see.
Your auction voice, right?
I need to work on it. I should have practiced before this, honestly. As I'm seeing them come in, I've done this a few times this week. I'm like, I did not dust up or work on any of those skills I don't have.
All good. Okay, so I see some solution. I see, yeah, go to market. We got business model. All right, so we got some top 3 so far. And then a couple zeros, which I guess it makes sense. Wow, 0 on product. So it gives you a little bit of feel for like everyone feels that like, yeah, I know what my product is. I know what I need to show. Okay.
Yeah, it's looking like go-to-market and business model are the winners, like very head-to-head.
Okay, awesome. And so as that sort of wraps up, I would love to get specific questions out of that. And so either if you want to raise your hand and come up on stage, share a little bit more, we can dig into detail there. If it's in the chat, it'll be a little bit harder for me to find, excuse me, but if Steph, if you can kind of
so just real quick, attendees, I love the questions coming in, but this is your time to get like great one-on-one advice. You're going to see a raise hand button on the bottom right of your screen, right to the left of the chat. And if you click that, we can bring you on stage, which I think would be pretty great. So I'm going to stay here to see if there's any takers.
It would, because I have no idea right now. I'm just talking to a box, and I love Stephanie. And
no, I get it. There's 79 people out there. I feel like one of them should want to raise their hand. So I say we just talk about it for another minute. You know, some pressure on this side. See if anyone's daring. If we were in person, they would raise their hand. So, we got one. All right, perfect. So I'm going to welcome Angela on stage.
Hello. Hi, David. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you as well.
Good. So I do have a question regarding business model. So I'm building I built a mobile application, and our initial gut feeling was going as a subscription-based business model. However, I see that there are other options that could work. So how can I express that in a pitch deck, or should I just stay with what I think initially? And maybe when I'm pitching, suggest the other options, or what would be your recommendation?
Perfect. Thank you so much for the question. And everyone else will benefit, because I think this is something that comes up quite a bit, that how much evidence that do you have now that subscription is ultimately the way you're going to monetize? Like, do you have a couple data points? You have a couple customers coming in that are validating that? Or is that just more of the, I think this is what's the best way to monetize, but I'm open to change in the future?
I have had both, Dave. Like a couple of companies that we have talked to, they are okay with the subscription model. However, there are others, and this app is in construction, so construction is very revenue sensitive. So what they are suggesting is maybe going to like project instead of seat, like going project subcontractor, for instance, like depending, like charging every project depending on the number of subcontractors and all of that. So I've had both.
Okay.
I think it would work. So
I think what I would do in your case is that you have an idea in the long term of how ideally the service will monetize itself, and it's actually okay. It's good that you're getting decent feedback from the market, right? Because it's not just, I thought about this thing, I thought it'd be really interesting. And if you're getting conflicting feedback, which is often the case, you've got to make the choice as to which makes the most sense right now and which makes the most sense in the long term. And so, models like freemium have popped up, right? Because of exactly that there's this sort of trade-off. And so in your case, I would continue to press forward with the fact that you've got these existing customers that want to subscribe, and it's fantastic because it's showing value, and they're coming back all the time, and they're using the product. And then either in the slide itself, you can sort of spotlight on the side that a handful of customers are actually expressing willingness to pay that's outside of this primary business model, that depending on how real that is or how current that data is, you may want to elevate it a little bit. And so if you're talking to an investor where they're like, oh, have you thought about this other? It's like, interesting, you should mention that. And the reason why I have this on the side was that we've had some customers ask that. And then you can talk through, very openly what you're thinking about. It's like, although I really thought subscription was the way to go, we're seeing some demand here. We're open to exploring that, because in the early days, you got to figure out, what do those things work, and how it works. The challenge that you've got to, or the balance that you've got to strike is that if it's a lot of consulting type gigs and you're pitching to an investor that really understands and pushing for SaaS, suddenly your business model's out of whack. And so even if they are aligned in terms of your vision, your mission, your product, everything else, but if they don't know how ultimately this thing will evolve, and let's just say in the extreme case, it becomes like this crazy consulting firm and nothing subscription, but people are willing to pay silly amounts because they want all these one-off contracts and one-off projects, then that's a really different business, right? And it's okay that it evolves in that direction. But right now, if you're in a place where you're not sure either of the two, then I think it's okay to mention both of those. The thing to be aware of is as soon as you get a really clear indication that one is better than the other, then you do want to flip the narrative, right? And just make sure you talk about the other one going forward. And then it's likely that some of the other parts of the other part of your deck will then have to flow into that better, right?
Okay.
And I'll just toss out one example. Maybe I'll be a little opaque because the founder's great, and she brought a company public, and so I can't. Well, anyway, I'll share the specific data point in that. In her new venture, because the markets are where they are, even though it involves both hardware and software, they were forced to describe a very software-based model for something that is typically sold to a consumer, right? And so for this thing that you're selling to a consumer, the most natural business model would be like, oh, I'm going to buy this thing, I'm going to, bring it home, and I get to use it, and all that good stuff. But because of the stage that they're at, there's been a lot of pressure from the outside investors to how can you get recurring revenues out of this? It's different unit economics and all that. And so they had to shoehorn that subscription model into the deck. And for some businesses, it kind of fits, and some businesses it doesn't. In this case, it sort of does. You can make a case why someone would want a subscription, but that's that's another dynamic. And so I think that's also somewhat applicable to you.
Okay, so I guess it is okay if one model works now, then it could change, and that an investor is okay with that kind of mentality.
Yeah. Well, especially if you have real data, right? And everything on this is kind of like a 50-50 sort of thing, or 49-51 sort of thing. But as soon as you have clarity around it, the more confident you can be, the more that you can use data to back that up, the better. And so if you're legitimately at a point where you don't know yet, that's okay, right? I wouldn't want you to hide that fact, and maybe we can talk through exactly, how that business model should evolve.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Dave.
Great.
And David, we have two more people if their hands raised as well. If you're up for it,
yes.
Bring them both up at the same time, or one at a time. What makes the most sense?
Let's bring them both up.
All right, Kyle and Chris, I'm bringing you up. Okay.
Let's see. I don't know. Can you see? I don't know if I'm popping up there. My name's Kyle. Hi,
hey,
David.
Kyle.
That was awesome. Thank you so much. I'm the founder of DenScore. And I have a question about the investor deck for the market opportunity slide. So our market opportunity is mainly focused on the market that we're targeting to go to market. But we have a few different markets that we're targeting. And I guess my question really stems around, the market that we're targeting to get to market, it doesn't hit that, $100 million SOM. It's much smaller than that. So do we combine like the different markets in that slide to show like what the actual opportunity is, or can we have a couple different market opportunity slides, like for the one market that we're targeting to get to market, and then the follow-up market that we're targeting after that, or kind of what are your thoughts on that?
Thank you for the question, Kyle. This one also comes up quite a bit, and so I think there's others in the audience that also benefit from this. I would absolutely not have multiple market opportunity slides, right? That's just terrible idea. So don't do that at all. What you describe very frequently is this like beachhead problem, where what you want to do is find a wedge into a particular market that you can own, that your solution is really adapt to solving, and have that be like your entry point into something bigger. And so I think in your case, especially in industries where there's multiple verticals, where you can apply them multiple verticals, you want to be very specific about like that focus. And so most of your deck, the product, should talk a lot about like how you're going to be really good. And I'm assuming you're at a pretty early stage.
Yeah, we'll be right.
So cool. And at an early stage, the key thing is making sure that you get to play the next round. And so I really want to understand how you're going to land on this beachhead, right? And then you land and expand, right? And so for the market opportunity slide, for the TAM, I would include that really big, like all the verticals, all the applications, and all of the good stuff. For the SAM, where you begin to narrow it, here's where there's a great talking point, right? That in the immediate case, what's the serviceable addressable market is one where we're looking at a couple key verticals, and you can actually even narratively say, we don't consider this vertical as part of the SAM because, for whatever reason, but that's how you're limiting it. Geo is limiting it. Your solution will obviously grow over time, but right now your kind of sweet spot for the scope of your solution, and then when you go to your competition slide, that's essentially the competitors in that set, is going to be this other thing. And then when you go down to the smallest one, that SOM, I would actually include as broad of a notion as you can. And I don't know whether or not I would like limit to a single vertical, because if that single vertical gets really, really small, then I'm like, well, is it really even worth that being your beachhead? So you may want to rethink that a little bit. But when you then describe this last piece, you're going to enter this market in such a way where then you land and you hit all these other ones. And so in that SOM, I would describe that as for your solution, for the one particular vertical, like how you really feel like, it's a sweet spot there. And then I don't know if you do it like through color coding kind of thing, where, that maybe that one has just like multiple colors in it, and sort of breaking the norm a little bit. But you could say, of the SAM, I feel awesome about this, like, the fourth subset, which is this one really tight vertical, and describe it that way.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, no, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Yep. No worries. A little bit of an aside. This is probably more about product strategy, but it's very relevant. Frequently, when people are developing new products, it's either like a horizontal strategy that applies to multiple verticals. Think like Google, right? Google's not industry specific. In the early days, Google did this great thing where they developed, PageRank, and that was a super relevant way for people to find pages. And so they're this one tier, and they do that tier really well, and they started growing, doing other things. That's one strategy. And so you may have like a certain TAM, SAM, SOM for that. Another one is like a vertical where you're targeting something that's pretty specific, but it's a bit of a one-stop shop for all of the things in that vertical, in which case then the TAM looks really different, because let's just say travel is one, right? That was a TripAdvisor in the early days. Travel is one vertical version of this one particular product. And then over time, you could apply that concept to other verticals, but travel's big enough, right? Where you don't have TripAdvisor for 30 different verticals, and it's not the same. It's a different company, right? It's a different venture. So if you're finding yourself in a vertical that's so tight, that's so narrow, then think about whether or not there's something actually broader than that, like a bunch of other verticals kind of stacked together as being your TAM. But that's another kind of product strategy thing, like you do to go horizontal or vertical.
Yeah, that helps a lot. Thank you so much.
Okay, great. Thanks for the question.
Hi, David. Thanks for the session today. This is incredible. I'm just building my pitch deck right now, so this is perfect timing. I have a quick question on competition. And so firstly, like how concerned should we be about competition going into building the pitch deck? And then how should we think about strategizing the type of competition that we're competing against? So in my instance, I'm building a recruiting and career management platform. So essentially what I'm trying to do is unbundle part of LinkedIn. So going up against LinkedIn can be quite a, for a young startup could be kind of perceived as pretty aggressive, but there's also other companies in the space who've done something similar in different verticals, as you just said. So like TripleByte has done a similar thing for engineers. So how would you think about targeting like a big incumbent and thinking through what they do poorly and innovating on that and positioning, and then again, how in depth should we be going on what the competition is doing and how they can respond, given a lot of things that we hear is based around like, don't worry too much about competition, focus on the customer and build the product that they need.
Yeah. I think that's good advice, right? Like if you take a look at the space too much, it's very, very misleading, right? Because then you end up chasing stuff and that doesn't make a lot of sense. For the purposes of the pitch deck that you're building, I do think it's important to draw those lines. And so I'll just kind of default back to the axes and the 2x2. In the recruiting space, I think what you'd want to do is find a bunch of different axes where the incumbents are structurally unable to excel on, right? And so I don't know what that is. I mean, it's just sort of from what you've told me, it sounds kind of intriguing, but maybe there's like one or two axes where it's like LinkedIn just does a terrible job of that, right? And so, one example might be in LinkedIn, there's no notion of a degrees of strength, right? So maybe you and I are going to connect right after this and we'll connect on LinkedIn, but Steph and I have known each other for 5+ years, right? And on LinkedIn, we look the same, right? And so maybe it's like degree of strength is like 1 and super important in your industry because, if you're going to reach out for a referral, then it matters a lot. And so random example, right? So that's one. And then there's probably some other one. And so when you do that, then you're defining a couple different things. You're defining what your differentiator is going to be. And so it's a little selfish, right? Because then you're like, all right, here, I'm going to put myself in a place there. And then the natural incumbent is you're going to have to put them somewhere else. Now, they clearly have other advantages, right? They got a ton of data. They've got market presence. They've got critical mass. They have all these things. So that's okay. I think in the beginning, you want to carve out that map in such a way where that differentiator is one that you get to build. And when I think about ventures, I think about as you do stuff, you're developing muscle, and over time that muscle becomes hard to copy, right? Because if you're exercising this one, you get really good at, let's just say it like, personalization and understanding, the person and all that other stuff, then it's hard for someone else to copy. And so that's kind of, I think that's where you want to draw the boundaries. And so while I'd say don't pay too much attention about the competitors in that sense, I think you do want to draw out that space in such a way that it's advantageous, or it's good for you.
That's incredible. Thanks so much for taking a ton of notes from the session today. And it's going to be very helpful. Thank you.
All right. Good luck. Thanks for the question.
Thanks, David.
Any more, or we can?
So we don't have any more video questions, but we have a ton of text questions, and about 10 minutes left.
Yeah. Why don't we grab a couple text questions, and then I've got 5 minutes of a wrap up. Actually,
perfect.
3 minutes of a wrap up. Yep.
Yeah. So I guess let's start through the list. So one of them is, how specific and detailed should a founder be when they're in the pre-seed stage and looking for funding?
Yep. It's tough when you're in the pre-seed stage because you have a lot of data, right? And so it's largely going to be about the story and your unique view of the world. And for pre-seed, if you have some traction, that's awesome, right? Because if it's not starting from scratch, that just gives a little bit of evidence. But in the case where you're putting together the pitch deck for that pre-seed, a lot of it will be around the team. A lot of it will be around whether or not the space itself resonates. Much of it will be around whether or not the solution makes sense. And going back to the previous question about like the space, does the space matter? And so however you're positioning yourself on your landscape slide, all of that has to make sense, right? And so if that all hangs true, then cool, let's meet, let's talk, let's see, how do you get to the next level? But the thing to keep in mind is like every single big thing started at 0, right? And so everything that was anything started at the pre-seed stage.
Thank you. Recommendations on a deal time, if any, for the minutes or seconds per slide to not lose interest with your pitch.
Okay. I've seen so many different examples. I think the main one would be plan for if you had 20 minutes, roughly speaking, right? So don't plan for an hour because no one's got that level of attention. I think if you plan for 5 or 10, you're going to be too rushed, but plan for if you had 20 minutes of uninterrupted time, how would you break things out? And so if we're looking at this, this is definitely not going to add up to 20 minutes, but I'm going to go through and try this. It would be, see if someone can actually count up the minutes. So intro slide, maybe less than a minute. Problem slide, 1 to 90 seconds. Solution slide, probably 2. Market opportunity, 1-ish. Product, if it's a deep product, you probably want to spend like 2 minutes or so. Go to market, maybe 2 or 3. Like because that's the first time we really talk about that. Business model, hopefully less than 1. Competition, maybe 1. Traction is 1. Team is 2. Ask is probably where you park, and so that's maybe like 1, and then you're gonna get some questions like where the round is and all that other stuff.
I mean, that was 16 minutes. So
okay, all right, and then thanks for adding. I was just shouting out.
So guys, I think that was a really good breakdown. I hope you wrote it all down.
Yeah. We're just making this up as we go. But in all seriousness, it will depend a lot on the industry, right? So let's say you're in an industry where the problem is just so obvious, everyone faces it, and you're talking to an investor that knows the industry super well. You barely even need to touch the problem, right? Like don't spend, like it's probably like 10 seconds. Like, yeah, this problem, yeah, this is exactly the space that we're in. Let's jump right into the solution. If you're doing something where you have to really educate the person that this is a problem, then you want to spend more time on that, right? And so it might be something like, did you know that the typical person spends, 4 hours a day doing this thing? And it's like, whoa, I had no idea that person was doing that. And then what's worse is they're doing blah, 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 blah. You're going to spend, closer to the 90 seconds to 2 minutes on that before you get into the solution. And so I think you want to gauge the audience. Maybe one last chat question and then
one more. And I actually think that kind of like this question will piggyback off into what you're saying. But speaking of like technology and having to educate the investor, like how much time should you spend digging into that technology? Like how much info should you be telling them in the pitch?
Yeah, this is another dependent on the audience. And so on one extreme, you spend lots of time if the investor's very technical and wants to go into details. 2, if the primary risk is around the technology. A good example is ride sharing. Ride sharing, Uber, Lyft, the primary risk in that business was not technology, right? There was zero doubt that you could put together a website, you could put together a mobile app, you could stick something in cloud, and so you could, develop something that you could push a button. All of the risk was around behavior, right? Would someone get into a stranger's car? Could they figure out how to get rid of the taxi medallions and get around that regulatory? And so in the case where technology is not the risk and the person's not particularly interested in technology, then very little time, right? And so think about it that way. Good. Keeping us on track. I'm going to zip through the last couple slides. And I did post all this again. If you go to davidchang.me/startup tips, posted a link to this deck. So feel free to download it and take a look through it. So a few different things, some templates for you. So I relied very heavily on things I've seen from other places. And so NextView puts together this fantastic guide. They used to have 2 different versions. There's like a sort of standard investor version, and then they've got this other version called The Show, which I thought was great for like a longer sort of narrative fireside chat kind of thing. Pillar has a fantastic set of resources for founders. In addition to the deck, there's a whole bunch of other founder tips and tricks and videos. And so you should check them out as well. And also do a plug for Zoe. She's done a fantastic overview of like how to actually put together a pitch deck. And so there's a link to her stuff there. I haven't used this service before, but as I was prepping for this week, I came across Beautiful.ai. You can plug in your content and they generate a deck for you. And so that might be something to try out. Again, I've never used it before, but it seemed kind of slick. And then the last kind of 2 things are just make sure you don't include too much text in the very beginning. Get your story right, get the talking points right, but you want to have, at least in the very first pitch deck, just enough data on the deck to tease and open up the conversation, right? So maybe a couple key takeaways, maybe the slide itself says the key point, but not a ton of detail around the text side. When you send a follow-up pitch deck, maybe include that version, right, where it almost has the speaker notes as part of it, not the speaker notes per se, but like, you know, details like in the slide. So you should use images liberally. I'm a huge fan of free services like Unsplash, and there's like Pexels, and there's a whole bunch of other places, but I do rely on that, as you can tell from this one particular deck. And then icons as well, right? And so take a look through the stuff like the Noun Project. I'm a fan of using visuals as a way to communicate complicated topics. And so hopefully some of this stuff will work for your style. And then the very final thing is for inspiration, if you want to take a look at others' pitch decks, a lot of the materials that I drew from here were from SlideBeam, DocsEnd, et cetera. And so there's a few links there. So feel free to cruise through it. I think you'll see a lot of things that work well, see a lot of things that don't work well, but at least it'll give you some food for thought as you develop your own pitch deck. And with that, I'll turn it back to Stephanie. And thanks for everyone for your time this morning.
Yeah, thank you so much, David. This has been incredibly insightful.